Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à notre midi causerie au CELAT. On a le plaisir aujourd'hui de recevoir un collègue de l'Université d'Islande, M. Orri Vésteinsson. Et comme j'ai évoqué dans mon cours mardi matin avec mes premières années, qu'il n'y a rien plus romantique de journée de Saint-Valentin que des Vikings, les Norrois, etc. Donc, M. Vésteinsson a fait sa thèse à l'Université of London sur le processus de christianisation en Islande, sur les prêtres, le pouvoir et les changements sociaux. Elle a aussi une maîtrise en analyse technique qui provient de l'Institute of Archaeology aussi à Londres. Parmi ses divers projets de recherche, il travaille sur les prospections des chapelles puis des églises. Il travaille sur les postes-retraites post-médiévales en Islande. Il dirige aussi certaines fouilles archéologiques. Believe me, Orri, everything I'm saying about you is true. Puis il a aussi chapeauté un projet Landscapes of Settlement, qui est un projet majeur en Islande à partir de l'an 2000. Donc, il travaille beaucoup sur les questions de la construction identitaire en Islande et sur l'histoire et l'archéologie, de la colonisation, des églises et de divers autres sujets. Donc, aujourd'hui, on a le plaisir de lui entendre sur le sujet de Constructing Identities in the North Atlantic Viking Age. Donc, on va avoir une conférence autour de 45 minutes, suivie par une période de questions. Donc, je lui cède la parole. Orri, sorry. Come on up.
Thank you.
There you go.
Well, good morning, and first of all, let me thank you, Alison and Jim, for inviting me here and giving me a chance to talk about a theme which I talk about quite a lot, and Alison assured me that people would be interested in this sort of thing here. There's a little bit of background. I don't know how much all of you know about Icelandic history, but identity and ethnicity have been issues for the Icelanders as many other people in the world for a long time. Iceland was a part of the Norwegian kingdom from the late 13th century onwards, and got transferred to the Danish kingdom along the way, and by the 19th century was essentially a sort of half colony, half province of Denmark, when a nationalistic movement arose from the 1830s onwards, pointing out that the Icelanders spoke a completely different language from Denmark or Norway, and had their own identity. And interestingly enough, if you look at there was a huge debate about nationality and independence in the 19th century and early 20th century in Iceland. It was all well-mannered. What we call the struggle for independence was never violent. It was all happened in cozy meeting rooms with the essentially quite civilized Danish government. But there was a lot of discussion both among the Icelanders in general, but also academics about the sort of how separate the Icelanders were, how different they were from others. For most Icelanders, at least by the late 19th century, this was not a complicated issue. And it's interesting that it's only towards the end of the struggle for independence in the early 20th century, Iceland became a republic in 1944, that this became a more complicated issue. And if you read history books from the late 19th century, the issue is clear enough. The Icelanders came from Norway in the late 9th century, in the Viking Age, and so they were essentially Norwegians originally, but then they sort of became Icelandic and became different, mainly because the Norwegians developed in a different direction. So the basic idea is that the Icelanders, the basic 19th century idea was that the Icelanders were those that didn't change. It was just the Scandinavians that went their own ways, and there's this idea lingers quite a lot. Many Icelanders would still put it this way, that Icelanders are the original Norse or Scandinavian people, that it's the others who degenerated. And the sources we have about what was happening in the Viking Age in Iceland are medieval sagas and stories written in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, and many of those talk about a Celtic element, people coming from Ireland and Scotland, and with Celtic names. So it's long been well known that there must have been some mixing. But the original take on this was that this didn't really change very much, that it maybe added some color, but not really substance, that the ethnicity was basically Scandinavian. And there was just a dash of Celticness, which made us a little bit more interesting, but didn't really change very much. In the sort of 1920s and 30s, when the constitutional aspects of the battle for independence had been more or less sorted out. Iceland was an independent country from 1918. It just had a Danish king for a quarter of a century longer. These sort of the struggle for definitions hardened, interestingly enough, and you begin to see sort of two main sorts of ideas developing. Both of which would maintain that the Icelanders are unique, that they are not only are they are a separate, distinct nation, but also that they're unusually especially great, and then people started to look for explanations for this uniqueness, and there are two sort of main threads here. One is that the Icelanders are of basically Norwegian stock, or whatever stock thereof is maybe not so important, but rather that they were shaped by their environment, that it was the North Atlantic environment that turned us into the distinct and separate and great nation that we are. The other main thread is that there was a unique blending or mixing of nationalities that created this greatness, and this is the mixing of the Scandinavian and the British or Celtic. Many there are papers from the 1940s and 50s which deal explicitly with these ideas, and the environmental argument in particular was very well developed by scholars like Sigurður Þórarinsson, a geologist who had a great interest in history and was an influential scholar, not only in history but also in geology. He developed the method of tephrochronology, which some of you no doubt know. The method of dating archaeological deposits from volcanic ash. So he was a imaginative guy, but this idea also remains very strong with Icelanders, that they were shaped by the unusual environment, and in fact his particular argument is more complicated, because he saw it as a unique mixing, the origins, the cultural background the settlers brought with them, and how they coped in this quite different environment, and in particular the inability of this environment to sustain cereal agriculture was a big issue for him. But many others have focused simply on the origins, and we can call this, and it is called primordialism, the idea that identity or ethnicity is somehow sort of hardwired into our genes, and that it's not really something that can change so much. If you are born an Icelander, you are an Icelander and will always be an Icelander. And many Icelanders feel like this, and of course many people all around the world feel that their ethnicity is somehow comes with them. And this is, I think, it is what appears to be a common sense attitude to ethnicity, and relatively recent development of DNA studies, for instance, pretty much the significance of the DNA results is primarily meaningful if you believe this. If you believe that you can trace culture or identity through where the genes go. And that's certainly how DNA studies, for instance, of Icelandic origins have been interpreted. They've been interpreted in this way that that's what's significant about the colonization of Iceland is where the genes come from, and many sort of biologists would say, well, that's all you need to know. That's all that's interesting about it. But that's something. That's the if there's a particular idea I'm going to be arguing against here, that's that one. The other main sort of idea which can be contrasted with primordialism, you could call situationism, and I'm sure many of you heard about the idea of situational ethnicity. In the Icelandic context, this goes back at least to Christian Eldjárn, who was in many ways the father of modern archaeology in Iceland. In his 1956 doctoral thesis about the grave goods from the Viking Age in Iceland, he was primarily interested in ethnicity and ethnicity formation. Where were the Icelanders from? Can we see this from the grave goods? And what is it? What do they tell us about Icelandic ethnicity? And his results, based on his careful analysis of this corpus of material, was that as a whole, the Icelandic assemblage was most like the Norwegian, but that there were still significant differences, and that there were both British and Irish and Baltic elements within this, and that there were unique combinations that which suggested that there were individuals in 10th century Iceland who had different tastes from what you would expect in Norway, for instance. And so his idea was basically that there were people coming mainly from Norway, but also from further east and from the British Isles and Ireland, and that they mixed, and that they made that they developed their own identity in the 10th century. So that so already in the third, fourth generation, a separate identity had emerged. And I will be coming to a similar sort of conclusion based on different sorts of data and with slightly different ramifications. Since the 1950s, the primordialist view still seems to be the sort of the basic attitude. But there hasn't really been so much debate about ethnicity or origins as there was in the middle of the 20th century, and the focus has shifted towards issues of dating, which Icelandic archaeologists were very occupied with in the 1970s and 80s. So when did the colonization take place? We think we have a good handle on that by now. And in the last 20 years or so, the main focus has shifted towards society formation, what happened after people came to Iceland, and in a way that's still the main focus, and it is in fact the main focus of my research. But I think trying to understand what was happening in Iceland in the 10th century also involves trying to understand issues of identity and ethnicity. Now, just very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with this process, what we are talking about in the North Atlantic in the Viking Age is that by the end of the 8th century, we seem to have Norse settlement in the Shetland Islands, which were already occupied by Pictish people and had been occupied since the Mesolithic. But there are, at least by the sort of 1770s, 80s, it seems that people with a Norwegian or Norse culture are settling there. sometime in the 9th century, they move out to the Faroe Islands. There's a source, a contemporary source from the 820s, an Irish scholar working at the Frankish court who had reports of people who had sailed into the North Atlantic, had gone to the Faroes and Iceland, and we know from him that around 800 neither of these places were settled. There may have been some Irish hermits that went there on sort of religious expeditions, but then not to live. But the Faroes, according to this source, were frequently visited by what he called Norwegian pirates. So it's sometime after 800 that the Faroes are settled, and there are radiocarbon dates from the 9th century. There is, in fact, growing evidence that people were visiting the Faroes much earlier, presumably from the Scottish Isles. In Iceland, we have much denser evidence. There are two, and on top of the radiocarbon dates, we have the tephrochronology, which I mentioned earlier, the dating of archaeological deposits with volcanic ash. And extremely helpfully, there's a tephra layer, volcanic ash layer from 871, plus minus 2 years, which underlies pretty much all the earliest sites we find. So we can see that people are coming there in large numbers just after 871. There are only 2 sites with evidence for human presence before this, and at both sites it looks as if this human presence was there only a matter of few years before. So it is happening in the last quarter of the 9th century. And then these same people moved on to Greenland in the late 10th century. There we have a traditional date, 983, but it seems from the radiocarbon dates that are coming out that people were probably there already by mid-century. So there's a progressive colonization of these lands. The Faroes, Iceland had never been inhabited by humans before. Greenland had been, but there were no people in southern Greenland at the time when the Norse came, and they didn't get into contact with the Thule Inuit until much later, 12th, 13th centuries. They did go on expeditions further west, as I'm sure you know, but this did not lead to any permanent settlement. But I will be focusing mainly on Iceland, primarily because it is the best known archaeologically, but I think these sort of results also hold for the Faroes and Greenland. So just to give you a little bit of an idea about the archaeological situation in Iceland, here's a map which shows the distribution of early sites. In the black circles, of 3 of which are in the northeast, are sites which date to between 930 and between 870 and 930 or 40, and so we have a growing number of these, and most of these have been discovered just in the last few years. There are 2 sites which I mentioned earlier, which are earlier than 870. They're both in the southwest, and then there is a pretty much even scatter of sites all around the country, which don't have these exact dates, but are early. And we do think that the whole country was occupied already in the late 9th century, and many of these 870 to 930, 40 sites are pretty marginal. They're not the sort of sites you would expect people to occupy unless they had, if they had another choice. They are a last resort sort of places. There are still a lot of gaps in this, but this is the sort of general picture. People are here are in Iceland before 870. There's then a huge surge of immigration in the following decades, 870s, 880s, 890s. By the beginning of the 10th century, the whole country is occupied, but immigration, in fact, continues, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But occupation and infilling of the landscape happens very rapidly, and that's a. There are problems with this, as you can imagine, but that's how it looks at present. Now, if we look at this early evidence, the evidence for these pre-930 or 940 sites, and we look for ethnic markers at these sites, we turn up practically nothing. In fact, most of these sites are very poorly known. They're mostly known from single trenches where we see turf walls, signs of cultivation or middens below these tephra layers from the 930s and 40s, and it's really only three large assemblages with animal bone and artifacts that we have to work with, the artifacts in these collections are well, the collections are small. They are few. These pieces, and they are largely nondescript. They don't have any ethnic connotations. They are the sort of things you expect to find in any Iron Age site: iron nails, knives, stone implements, and so on. So the cultural indicators of these earliest sites are just general North European Iron Age, and they wouldn't allow us to say anything more about where these people came from, and this is of course what we would expect. That's the general background, but nothing more specific than that. The only site which is well known from this early period is called Sveagakot, where the Icelanders here in this room have worked for years, and this has several phases. The earliest phase, dated from the 880s to the 920s, consists of a sunken featured building, which was the dwelling and the byre for maybe 15 or 14 to 16 heads of cattle, and an outdoor activity area. There's a second phase also with sunken featured dwellings over here, and nondescript building over here, and then a third phase from the late 10th century, when we finally have a hall, something you could call a hall. Sometimes these are called Longhouses, a very distinctively Norse kind of building. The sunken featured buildings are to my mind at least, not ethnically meaningful. There's no ethnic symbolism to them. We had a Polish crew working with us at Sveagakot, and they think that these sunken featured buildings, pit houses, are Eastern European. And because that's how Eastern Europeans lived during this time, and that's quite right. And these buildings share a number of similarities to these sort of buildings in that region, but they're also found elsewhere. They're also found in urban contexts in Scandinavia, and although they're not found as dwellings in rural Scandinavia, there are sunken featured buildings there. So it's not a very useful house form to pinpoint ethnicity, and I think that's the main thing here. But it certainly opens up the possibility that we might look for the origins of the settlers elsewhere than in Scandinavia or Britain or Ireland. That it's perfectly possible that some of them came from continental Europe as well. And to my mind, there's nothing that precludes that. But I wouldn't see this as evidence for a sort of Polish migration to Iceland, as Przemysław Urbanczyk, my colleague, has argued. If we then look for sort of when signs of Norse ethnicity begin to come in, we see those signs early. There are pagan burials with grave-good assemblages, which are from the earliest period, but they are quite few compared to the later ones. The bulk of this material, the grave goods which have ethnic or cultural symbolism attached to them, are from the mid to late 10th century. And there are different ways to show this. The graph there shows burials dated by their beads, and beads often give a fairly tight chronological range, and you can see from this that there is really only one burial out of these 15 or something that is definitely early, and in fact it's too early, and which raises the possibility that it's these beads are residual in some way, that they were already old when they were deposited. But the rest of them all either are definitely from the late 10th century or can be from the late 10th century. And if we look at other types of objects, oval brooches, swords, and these sort of things, which allow some sort of chronological definition, with the same sort of a pattern emerges. The most of this stuff is from the late 10th century. There are one or two rich burials with these sort of objects in, which could be from the late 9th or early 10th century, as opposed to maybe 20 or 30 from the later part. So, and the same picture emerges if we look at the sort of objects we find on habitation sites or dwelling sites, and if we look at the dwellings themselves. In Sveaukot, for instance, we start to find these sort of objects, like this dragon head of a bone pin in the later 10th or early 11th century deposits, and there's quite a number of them compared to the blandness of the stuff, the earlier stuff, and all the sort of datable longhouses or halls that we have, and most of them aren't datable. Most of them just have a generalized Viking Age date. But those that we can narrow down are not from the late 9th or early 10th century. They are from the mid to late 10th century or later, and they are strikingly uniform in their conception. The majority of them have these curved long walls. They have the fireplaces in the middle. They are very similar in their internal arrangements as well as their sort of outward appearance, and they are exaggerated in this and in the uniformity of this. So from one side to another, and it seems that these people are, by the mid 10th century, they're conforming to some sort of an ideal, and it's very easy to suggest what that ideal was. This is a reconstruction of one of the houses in Trelleborg, built by Danish King Harald Bluetooth in the 970s, where you have these same sort of buildings, built of different material, built of wood in Denmark, but in turf in Iceland. But the curvature of the walls, which is architecturally sort of quite a sort of complicating feature, and the internal arrangements are of the same kind, same sort of dimensions. The Trelleborg houses are bigger, but the concept is the same. So it seems to me, at least, that by the mid 10th century, the Icelanders are consciously adopting a symbolism, and it is at least to us it's most obvious in their architectural choices, but you can also see it in the artifacts they are carrying on them, personal ornaments like this one. Now, to make the story even more interesting, to me at least, there is increasing weight of evidence for sort of early Christianization in the North Atlantic. The traditional account is that the Icelanders and the Faroese became Christian because the Norwegian king at the time told them to do so in the year 1000, and there's been quite a lot of debate about this, sort of what this meant at the time, and did they really sort of, was it a real conversion or just a political convenience? And were they already Christian? There are some medieval traditions towards which suggest that some of them were, but the evidence of pagan burial customs seems to suggest that 1000 is about right. We have quite a lot of late 10th century burials, and some of them are from just around 1000. But we have also increasing evidence for the building of churches at least several decades before 1000. And an increasing number of radiocarbon dates which on Christian burials and these early churches which date back to the mid-10th century. And when these dates were only 2 or 3, it's as you know, it's easy with radiocarbon dates to suggest, well, that's just radiocarbon dates. They tend to have long ranges and so on. But there are, to my mind at least, there are too many of these sites by now, and too many of these burials with late 10th century dates that you cannot anymore ignore this evidence. And it's striking also that in Greenland, some of the earliest dates we now have for Norse settlement in Greenland are on Christian burials, which seem to be from the second or third or fourth quarter of the 10th century. So it's clear that some people were still pagan in Iceland in around 1000, but a lot of them were also starting to behave like Christians, and at least in the way they buried their dead, and to build churches, of which we have a respectable number. Here are some examples from around the North Atlantic, one from Greenland and one from the Faroes, Sandur, but the rest from Iceland. They are all late 10th or early 11th century. Some of them have better dates than others. But they're all essentially of the same kind. They are very small structures, less than 20 square meters, and they sometimes called private chapels. They are associated with individual households. They are not parish churches. So that actually has interesting ramifications, which I'm not going to go into. But certainly it seems that there's a popular acceptance of Christianity. It's not something that just the leaders of these societies are doing. These are pretty ordinary people who are building these structures. They're maybe not the bottom layer of society. They're not the poorest tenants, but they're not just the chieftains either. So, what does all this mean? For one thing, I think we need to be circumspect in how we interpret this, and as I think I've already mentioned, there are of course all sorts of problems with the scenario I'm trying to paint here, and so you just have to believe me that this is at least a reasonable interpretation of the evidence, but there are lots of gaps in the evidence. For one thing, sort of an absence of ethnic markers doesn't mean that there is an absence of ethnicity. I don't think you could say that the first 2 or 3 generations of Icelanders simply didn't have ethnicity because they didn't have so much ethnic markers as they had later. I think it means rather that ethnicity at that time was not sort of helpful in the situation, that displaying your ethnicity or your sort of signs of your origins wasn't well, may have been technically impossible because of poverty and things like that, but also that it may not have been socially or politically expedient. It may therefore sort of max a heterogeneity of the population, that these people are coming from different places. They are coming not just from Norway with a few Celtic slaves, but rather that they are coming from all over, and that they don't have any ethnicity in common as a group, and therefore displaying this ethnicity is maybe just not meaningful, let alone unhelpful. And that it only begins to become meaningful later when the population as a whole begins to have a sense of some sort of a unity of the people living on this island, and other developments, which I'll talk about presently. But I think probably mostly what this indicates is an absence or a limited presence of an upper class, because especially the grave goods are the ethnically meaningful grave goods, the symbolic stuff. It comes from the richer burials, quite obviously. And so the growing incidence of those sort of burials in the late 10th century signals to me not so much a ethnicity formation, but rather that there are simply more people who can afford this sort of stuff around, and for whom it is meaningful and necessary to display it. And I think if you look at other colonial situations, this makes sense, that the first 2 or 3 generations, the people who die in the colony are not necessarily the people who organize the colonization, and they're not the people for whom the colonization was necessarily meant to benefit. And to me, it makes sense to postulate that the people who organized they died elsewhere. They died back in Norway or the British Isles or Ireland or wherever. So that explains and then when we begin to have these sort of burials in the mid-10th century, it is because there is an emergent Icelandic upper class, a local upper class, which is making decisions about its identity, where it wants to situate it. We have evidence which suggests that upper class people continue to be imported into Iceland at least throughout the 10th century. Strontium analysis allows us to identify people who are born outside Iceland, and there have been pretty extensive analysis of that kind done on the pagan burial skeleton material. And a lot of them are, of course, born in Iceland, but a healthy proportion are born elsewhere. Many of those are from the earliest burials. Many of them are from burials which have practically no grave goods, or very, very little, or very or little in terms of meaningful, ethnically meaningful grave goods. But there are quite a few from the late 10th century of these immigrants. And most of those come from quite rich burials, and many of these are young people, sort of in their 20s or 30s, and one possible explanation for this is that sort of aristocrats are being imported as marriage partners for an Icelandic aristocracy to bolster their claims to power and priority, and certainly we see that sort of behavior in other colonial situations as well. Well, a well-known example, at least in this literature, is from Portuguese Brazil, where sort of impecunious Portuguese aristocrats continue to be a market for them for centuries after the establishment of Portuguese colonies in Brazil, and because the Brazilian aristocracy needed that sort of confirmation of their claims to power and authority. So we have a colonization which is organized by and for the benefit of an absent upper class, and the origins and identity of the individuals at that time was not socially or politically meaningful, and I think this may very well indicate that the actual origins were quite diverse. It's not necessary to think of that, but it certainly opens up the possibility. And I'm quite interested in the possibility that especially these sunken featured buildings may indicate an urban background to many of these people, because certainly in Hedeby and Aarhus, which are towns in southern Scandinavia, these are the sort of buildings you find in the back alleys of these towns. This is where the poor people in those towns lived, and if you think about sort of the recruiting problems that the people who were organizing the colonization had, it makes most sense to at least begin to try to recruit in towns where you have populations which are accessible. Recruiting in rural Norway is quite difficult from a practical point of view. It's just long distances, and so it makes sense to do this in the urban context, and that's where you will find people, individuals of different ethnic origins. And then it seems that we have the development of a native upper class, which probably begins already in the late 9th century, but becomes visible by the mid or 10th century. And these people, we can imagine, were keen to try to legitimize their authority by displaying links with the perceived homeland, Norway, and it's this that brings about this sort of exaggerated conformism to an ideal of Norseness. And in a context like Sveakot, this very small farm I showed you the plan of earlier, it seems that sort of by the late 10th century there must be been sort of peer pressure or social pressure from just the people around, sort of for them to conform, to do like everyone else does. And maybe this was quite natural. We don't have to think about this as a coercive thing. Maybe it was just sort of by the 950s or 60s, this was just something that everyone was doing, and just like at some point flat screen televisions become the things that you have to have, then you just do that. And if you don't, it's not necessarily subversive. It's just you're not conforming to what people expect of you, and what the sort of the new daughter-in-law will expect when she comes, and it's no longer acceptable to live in a sunken featured building. And we have this possible evidence of marriage alliances with a Norse gentry, and one thing that became a big issue with Icelandic identity and ethnicity later on in the 12th century was the perception of others, at least, and as well as the Icelanders themselves, that the Icelanders were particularly interested in and knowledgeable about Norse history, and by the 13th century they had certainly become specialists in this, and so they marketed themselves as poets and scholars who got commissions mainly at the royal court in Norway to recite poetry and write histories, and this is it's quite unusual and weird in many ways, but it's a possibility that this specialization goes back to this time, that it was something that created cultural capital not only within Iceland but also recognition from outside. So that's, I think, something that's worth exploring. I don't know how you would explore it, but at least worth thinking about. But it's also interesting that how keen they are to add Christianity at this time, because in Norway, for instance, there was a huge resistance to the introduction of Christianity, and it took a long time from the first Christian kings in the mid 10th century until Norway was properly converted to Christianity, which wasn't until the mid 11th century. So Ólafur Tryggvason, the king who is credited with making the Faroes and the Icelanders convert in 1000, he was just killed a few weeks later, and Norway reverted to paganism for 20 years. And whereas the story goes, at least the Faroes and the Icelanders, they just continue to be good Christians. In fact, evidence for an institutional church in these countries is much later. So it really seems like a sort of a bottom-up sort of Christianization, and that, and it may well be that this relates to different dynamics, or different spiritual needs, even, that these people were uprooted. The traditional religion was quite localized, and so transporting sort of pagan religion to a new country may have been technically quite difficult, and so you can imagine all sorts of good reasons for why Christianity would have a greater appeal to these immigrant societies than they had back home. But I also wonder whether there was an element of consciousness in this, in that it was politically and socially beneficial to add this layer, and that it reflected a sense of sort of purpose and modernity, if you like. That because Christianity was clearly the sort of the new thing in Northern Europe at this time, and by becoming a Christian, you were not only sort of signing up to a creed, you were also signaling an inclusion in a much larger club, and if the people in the North Atlantic were doing this consciously, they were also probably quite conscious that back in Norway and let alone Sweden, people were resisting this. They were the conservatives, whereas the people in the North Atlantic seem to have been more progressive. I'm certain they thought of it in these terms themselves, at least. So, and this might explain, of course, why when the message finally comes from Norway, when there is finally a Christian Norwegian king, that the conservatives in Iceland, which I'm sure there was a group of those, were keen to accept. Why it made sense to them to do what the Norwegian king did, because to them it wasn't really so much about religion. It was about identity, about sort of whether we are Norwegian or not. And so we'd have a progressive group which said, well, yes, we are Norwegian, but we are also Christian, and so we are more cool than the Norwegians. And then when the Norwegians finally seem to be seeing the light, the conservatives are happy to go along with that. Yeah, that's a possibility. So the implications of this, I think it is important for us as for archaeologists to realize that culture and ethnicity are not determined by geographic or biological origins. You cannot assess one from the other. Or at least not in a deterministic way. That said, it's still hardly a matter of free choice, and I'm not seeing this as a sort of I'm not imagining that it could have gone any other way. I'm sure the colonization of the North Atlantic was organized mainly by Norwegians or people with a Norse allegiance of some sort, and that when an Icelandic upper class or Faroese or Greenlandic upper class emerges, it wasn't really an option for them to become Celtic, but they still had within this. The parameters of Norseness, they had all sorts of choices they could make, and they did go for an extreme version of Norseness. They could have opted for Norse light, and I think that's the sort of the element of choice you can imagine in this sort of situation, and then that would have impacts later on. But the fact that they opted for this course then explains things down the way. And I think this might help to understand why the Icelanders became, by the 12th century, specialists in Norse history, how they could, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a faraway colony. And I think also this might throw light on other conversion processes which I haven't been talking about in Eastern Europe, where you have the same sort of setup. It's happening at the same time in Hungary and Poland and Russia, and where the story is traditionally told as sort of the king converts and then the rest will follow. But I think that if you looked more closely and if you allowed archaeology to throw light on that narrative, you would probably certainly find that it's more complicated than that, and possibly more similar to what I've been sketching in the North Atlantic. Thank you.